Reagan, played by Bridget Moynihan. Then, 39. Now, 55. Eddie Yanko, played by Vanessa Ray. Then, 32. Now, 45. Danny Reagan, played by Donnie Wahlberg. Then, 41. Now, 57. Jackie Curatola, played by Jennifer Esposito. Then, 37. Now, 53. Jamie Reagan, played by Will Estes. Then, 32. Now, 47. Frank Reagan, played by Tom Selleck. Then, 63. Now, 81. Henry Reagan, played by Len Cariou. Then, 71. Now, 87. Sean Reagan, played by Andrew Teresiano. Then, 7. Now, 23. Maria Baez, played by Marissa Ramirez. Then, 36. Now, 49. Abigail Baker, played by Abigail Hawke. Then, 28. Now, 44. Garrett Moore, played by Gregory Jbara. Then, 50. Now, 65. Sid Gormley, played by Robert Clahacy. Then, 52. Now, 68. Linda Reagan, played by Amy Carlson. Then, 42. Now, 58. Sergeant Anthony Renzulli, played by Nicholas Turturro. Then, 48. Now, 64. Jack Reagan, played by Tony Teresiano. Then, 10. Now, 26. Vinnie Cruz, played by Sebastian Sazzi. Then, 30. Now, 44. Anthony Abitamarco, played by Steve Scaripa. Then, 58. Now, 69. Rachel Whitten, played by Lauren Patton. Then, 26. Now, 34. Nikki Reagan Boyle, played by Sammy Gale. Then, 14. Now, 30. Dino Arbogast, played by John Ventimiglia. Then, 48. Now, 63.